This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of the Spirit and the Life of Today by Evelyn UNDERHILL. Chapter 5, Part B. I go on now to the second aspect of institutional religion, cultus. We at once make the transition from church to cultus when we ask ourselves, how can the church as an organized and enduring society do its special work of creating an atmosphere and imparting a secret? How is the traditional deposit of spiritual experience handed on, the individual drawn into the stream of spiritual history and held there? Remember, the church exists to foster and hand on not merely the moral life, the life of this world perfection, but the spiritual life in all its mystery and splendor, the life of more than this world perfection, the poetry of goodness, the life that aims at God. And this not only in elect souls which might conceivably make and keep direct contacts without her help, but in greater or less degree in the mass of men who do need help. How is this done? The answer can only be that it is mostly done through symbolic acts, and by means of suggestion and imitation. All organized churches find themselves committed sooner or later to an organized cultus. It may be rudimentary. It may reach a high pitch of aesthetic and symbolic perfection. But even the successive rebels against dead ceremony are found as a rule to invent some ceremony in their turn. They learn by experience the truth that men most easily form religious habits and tend to have religious experiences when they are assembled in groups and caused to perform the same acts. This is so because, as we have already seen, the human psyche is plastic to the suggestions made to it, and this suggestibility is greatly increased when it is living a gregarious life as a member of a united congregation or flock, and is engaged in performing corporate acts. The soldier's drill is essential to the solidarity of the army, and the religious service in some form is, apart from all other considerations, essential to the solidarity of the church. We need not be afraid to acknowledge that from the point of view of the psychologist, one prime reason of the value and need of religious ceremonies abides in this corporate suggestibility of man, or that one of their chief works is the production in him of mobility of the threshold, and hence of spiritual awareness of a generalized kind. As the modern mother whispers beneficent suggestions into the ear of her sleeping child, 125, so the church takes her children at their moment of least resistance and suggests to them all that she desires them to be. It is interesting to note how perfectly adapted the rituals of historic Christianity are to this end, of provoking the emergence of the intuitive mind and securing a state of maximum suggestibility. The more complex and solemn the ritual, the more archaic and universal the symbols it employs, so much the more powerful, for those natures able to yield to it, the suggestion becomes. Music, rhythmic chanting, symbolic gesture, the solemn periods of recited prayer are all contributory to this effect. In churches of the Catholic type, every object that meets the eye, every scent, every attitude that we are encouraged to assume, gives us a push in the same direction if we let it do its rightful work. For other temperaments the collective, deliberate, and really ceremonial silence of the Quakers, the hush of the waiting mind, the unforced attitude of expectation, the abstraction from visual image, works to the same end. In either case, the aim is the production of a special group consciousness, the reinforcing of languid or undeveloped individual feeling and aptitude by the suggestion of the crowd. This and its result is seen of course in its crudest form in revivalism, and on higher levels in such elaborate dramatic ceremonies as those which are a feature of the Catholic celebrations of Holy Week. But the nice warm devotional feeling with which what is called a good congregation finishes the singing of a favorite hymn belongs to the same order of phenomena. The rhythmic phrases, not as a rule very full of meaning or intellectual appeal, exercise a slightly hypnotic effect on the analyzing surface mind, and induce a condition of suggestibility open to all the influences of the place and of our fellow worshippers. The Authorized Translation of Ephesians verse 19, speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, whatever we may think of its accuracy, does as it stands describe one of the chief functions of religious services of the hearty congregational sort. We do speak to ourselves, our deeper, more plastic selves, in our psalms and hymns. So too in a common recitation, especially the chanting of a creed. We administer through these rhythmic affirmations, so long as we sing them with intention, a powerful suggestion to ourselves and everyone else within reach. We gather up in them, or should do, the whole tendency of our worship and aspiration, and in the very form in which it can most easily sink in. This lays a considerable responsibility on those who choose psalms and hymns for congregational singing, for these can as easily be the instruments of fanatical melancholy and devitalizing, as of charitable life-giving and constructive ideas. In saying all this, I do not seek to discredit religious ceremony, either of the naive or the sophisticated type. On the contrary, I think that in effecting this change in our mental tone and color, in prompting this emergence of a mood which, in the mass of men, is commonly suppressed, these ceremonies do their true work. They should stimulate and give social expression to that mood of adoration which is the very heart of religion, helping those who cannot be devotional alone to participate in the common devotional feeling. If, then, we desire to receive the gifts which corporate worship can most certainly make to us, we ought to yield ourselves without resistance or criticism to its influence, as we yield ourselves to the influence of a great work of art. That influence is able to tune us up, at least to a fleeting awareness of spiritual reality, and each such emergence of transcendental feeling is to the good. It is true that the objects which immediately evoke this feeling will only be symbolic, but after all, our very best conceptions of God are bound to be that. We do not or should not demand scientific truth of them. Their business is rather to give us poetry, a concrete artistic intuition of reality, and to place us in the mood of poetry. The great thing is that by these corporate liturgic practices and surrenders, we can prevent that terrible freezing up of the deep wells of our being which so easily comes to those who must lead an exacting material or intellectual life. We keep ourselves supple. The spiritual faculties are within reach and susceptible to education. Organized ceremonial religion insists upon it that at least for a certain time each day or week we shall attend to the things of the spirit. It offers us its suggestions and shuts off as well as it can conflicting suggestions, though, human as we are, the mere appearance of our neighbors is often enough to bring these in. Nothing is more certain than this. First, that we shall never know the spiritual world unless we give ourselves the chance of attending to it, clear a space for it in our busy lives, and next, that it will not produce its real effect in us unless it penetrates below the conscious surface into the deeps of the instinctive mind, and molds this in accordance with the regnant idea. If we are to receive the gifts of the cultus, we on our part must bring to it at the very least what we bring to all great works of art that speak to us, that is to say, attention, surrender, sympathetic emotion. Otherwise, like all other works of art, it will remain external to us. Much of the perfectly sincere denunciation and dislike of religious ceremony which now finds frequent utterance comes from those who have failed thus to do their share. They are like the hasty critics who dismiss some great work of art because it is not representative, or historically accurate, and so entirely miss the aesthetic values which it was created to impart. Consider a picture of the Madonna. Minds at different levels may find in this pure representation Bible history, theology, aesthetic satisfaction, spiritual truth. The peasant may see it in the portrait of the Mother of God, the critic a phase in artistic evolution, whilst the mystic may pass through it to new contacts with the spirit of life. We shall receive according to the measure of what we bring. Now consider the parallel case of some great dramatic liturgy rich with the meanings which history has poured into it. Take as an example, which everyone can examine for themselves, the Roman Mass. Different levels of mind will find here magic, theology, deep mystery, the commemoration under archaic symbols of an event. But above and beyond all these, they can find the solemn incorporated emotion of the Christian Church, and a liturgic recapitulation of the movement of the human soul towards fullness of life. through confession and reconciliation to adoration and intercession, that is, to charity, and thence to direct communication with and feeding on the divine word. To the mind which refuses to yield to it, to move with its movement, but remains in critical isolation, the Mass, like all other ceremonies, will seem external, dead, unreal, lacking in religious content. But if we do give ourselves completely and unself-consciously to the movement of such a ceremony, at the end of it we may not have learnt anything, but we have lived something. And when we remember that no experience of our devotional life is lost, surely we may regard it as worthwhile to submit ourselves to an experience by which, if only for a few minutes, we are thus filled to richer levels of life and brought into touch with higher values. We have indeed only to observe the enrichment of life so often produced in those who thus dwell meekly and without inner conflict in the symbolic world of ceremonial religion, and accept its discipline and its gifts, to be led at least to a humble suspension of judgment as to its value. A whole world of spiritual experience separates the humble little church mouse, rising at 6 every morning to attend a service which she believes to be pleasing to a personal God, from the philosopher who meditates on the Absolute in a comfortable armchair, and no one will feel much doubt as to which side the advantage lies. Here we approach the next point. The cultus, with its liturgy and its discipline, exists for and promotes the repetition of acts which are primarily the expression of man's instinct for God, and by these, or any other repeated acts, our ductile, instinctive life is given a definite trend. We know from Siemens' researches, 126, that the performance of any given act by a living creature influences all future performances of similar acts. That is to say, memory combines with each fresh stimulus to control our reaction to it. In the case of living organisms, says Bertrand Russell, practically everything that is distinctive both of their physical and mental behavior is bound up with this persistent influence of the past, and most actions and responses can only be brought under causal laws by including past occurrences in the history of the organism as part of the causes of the present response. 127. The phenomena of apperception, in fact, forms only one aspect of a general law. As that which we have perceived conditions what we can now perceive, so that we have done conditions what we shall do. It therefore appears that in spite of angry youthful revolts or mature sophistications, early religious training and especially repeated religious acts are likely to influence the whole of our future lives. Though all they mean to us seems dead or unreal, they have retreated to the dark background of consciousness and there live on. The tendency which they have given persists. We never get away from them. A church may often seem to lose her children, as human parents do, but in spite of themselves they retain her invisible seal and are her children still. In nearly all conversions in middle life, or dramatic returns from skepticism to traditional belief, a large part is undoubtedly played by forgotten childish memories and early religious discipline, searching up and contributing their part to the self's new apprehensions of reality. If, then, the cultus did nothing else, it would do these two highly important things. It would influence our whole present attitude by its suggestions, and our whole future attitude through unconscious memory of the acts which it demands. But it does more than this. It has as perhaps its greatest function the providing of a concrete artistic expression for our spiritual perceptions, adorations, and desires. It links the visible with the invisible by translating transcendent fact into symbolic and even sensuous terms. And for this reason men, having bodies no less surely than spirits, can never afford wholly to dispense with it. Hasty transcendentalists often forget this, and set us spiritual standards to which the race, so long as it is anchored to this planet and to the physical order, cannot conform. A convert from agnosticism with whom I was acquainted was once receiving religious instruction from a devout and simple-minded nun. They were discussing the story of the Annunciation, which presented some difficulties to her. At last she said to the nun, "Well, anyhow, I suppose that one is not obliged to believe that the Blessed Virgin was visited by a solid angel dressed in a white robe." To this the nun replied doubtfully, "No, dear, perhaps not, but still, you know, he would have to wear something." Now here, as it seems to me, we have a great theological truth in a few words. The elusive contacts and subtle realities of the world of the spirit have got to wear something, if we are to grasp them at all. Moreover, if the mass of men are to grasp them ever so little, they must wear something which is easily recognized by the human eye and the human heart, more by the primitive, half-conscious folk soul existing in each one of us, stirring in the depths and reaching out in its own way towards God. It is a delicate matter to discuss religious symbols. They are like our intimate friends. Though at the bottom of our hearts we may know that they are only human, we hate other people to tell us so. And, even as the love of human beings in its most perfect state passes beyond its immediate object, is transfigured and merged in the nature of all love, so too the devotion which a purely symbolic figure calls forth from the ardently religious nature, whether this figure be the divine Krishna of Hinduism, the Buddhist's Mother of Mercy, the Sufi's beloved, or those objects of traditional Christian piety which are familiar to all of us. This devotion, too, passes beyond its immediate goal and the relative truth there embodied, and is eternalized. It is characteristic of the primitive mind that it finds a difficulty about universals, and is at most home with particulars. The success of Christianity as a world religion largely abides in the way in which it meets this need. It is notorious that the person of Jesus, rather than the absolute God, is the object of average Protestant devotion. So too the Catholic peasant may find it easier to approach God through and in his special saint, or even a special local form of the Madonna. This is the inevitable corollary of the psychic level at which he lives, and to speak contemptuously of his superstition is wholly beside the point. Other great faiths have been compelled by experience to meet the need of a particular object on which the primitive religious consciousness can fasten itself. Conspicuous examples being the development within Buddhism of the cult of the Great Mother, and within poor Brahmanism of Krishna worship. Wherever it may be destined to end, here it is that life of the spirit begins, emerging very gently from our simplest human impulses and needs. Yet, since the universal, the idea, is manifested in each such particular, we need not refuse to allow that the mass of men do thus enjoy, in a way that their psychic level makes natural to them, their own measure of communion with the creative Spirit of God, and already live according to their measure a spiritual life. These objects of religious cultus, then, and the whole symbolic faith world which is built up of them, with its angels and demons, its sharply defined heaven and hell, the divine personifications which embody certain attributes of God for us, the purity and gentleness of the mother, the simplicity and infinite possibility of the child, the divine self-giving of the cross, more, the lamb, the blood, and the fire of the revivalists, the oil and water, the bread and wine of a finished sacramentalism, all these may be regarded as the vestures placed by man, at one stage or another on his progress, on the freely given but ineffable spiritual fact. Like other clothes, they have now become closely identified with that which wears them, and we strip them off at our own peril, for this proceeding, grateful as it may be to our intellects, may leave us face to face with a mystery which we dare not look at, and cannot grasp. So cultus has done a mighty thing for humanity, in evolving and conserving the system of symbols through which the infinite and eternal can be in some measure expressed. The history of these symbols goes back, as we now know, to the infancy of the race, and forward to the last productions of the religious imagination, all of which bear the image of our past. They are like coins, varying in beauty, and often of slight intrinsic value, but of enormous importance for our spiritual currency, because accepted as the representatives of a real wealth. In its symbols, the cultus preserves all the past levels of religious response achieved by the race, weaving them into the fabric of religion, and carrying them forward into the present. All the instinctive movements of the primitive mind, its fear of the invisible, its self-subjection, its trust in ritual acts, amulets, spells, sacrifices, its tendency to localize deity in certain places or shrines, to buy off the unknown, to set up magicians and mediators, are represented in it. Its function is racial more than individual. It is the artwork of the folk soul in the religious sphere. Here man's inveterate creative faculty seizes on the raw material given him by religious intuition, and constructs from it significant shapes. We misunderstand, then, the whole character of religious symbolism if we either demand rationality from it or try to adapt its imagery to the lucid and probably mistaken conclusions of the sophisticated modern mind. We are learning to recognize these primitive and racial elements in popular religion, and to endure their presence with tolerance, because they are necessary and match a level of mental life which is still active in the race. This more primitive life emerges to dominate all crowds, where the collective mental level is inevitably lower than that of the best individuals immersed in it, and still conditions many of our beliefs and deeds. There is the propitiatory attitude toward unseen divine powers which the primitive mind, in defiance of theology, insists on regarding as somehow hostile to us and wanting to be bought off. There is the whole idea and apparatus of sacrifice, even though no more than the big apples and vegetable marrows of the harvest festival to be involved in it. There is the continued belief in a deity who can and should be persuaded to change the weather, or who punishes those who offend him by famine, earthquake, and pestilence. Vestigial relics of all these phases can be discovered in the Book of Common Prayer. There is further the undying vogue of the religious amulet. There is the purely magical efficacy which some churches attribute to their sacraments, rites, shrines, liturgic formulae, and religious objects, others to the texts of their scriptures. 128. These things, and others like them, are not only significant survivals from the past, they also represent the religious side of something that continues active in us at present. Since then, it should clearly be the object of all spiritual endeavor to win the whole man, and not only his reason for God, speaking to his instincts in language that they understand. We should not too hurriedly despise or denounce these things. Far better that our primitive emotions, with their vast store of potential energy, should be won for spiritual interests on the only terms which they can grasp, than that they should be left to spend themselves on lower objects. If, therefore, the spiritual or the regenerate life is not likely to prosper without some incorporation in institutions, some definite link with the past, it seems also likely to need for its full working out and propaganda the symbols and liturgy of a cultus. Here again, the right path will be that of fulfillment, not of destruction. A deeper investigation of the full meaning of cultus, the values it conserves, and the needs it must meet, a clearer and humbler understanding of our human limitations. We must also clearly realize as makers of the future that the Church has its special dangers of conservatism, coziness, intolerance, a checking of initiative, the domestic tendency to enclose itself and shirk reality. So the cultus has also its special dangers, of which the chief are perhaps formalism, magic, and spiritual sloth. Receiving and conserving as it does all the successive deposits of racial experience, it is the very home of magic, of the archaic tendency to attribute words and deeds, special power to a priestly caste, and to make of itself the essential mediator between creative spirit and the soul. Further, using perpetually as it does, and must, symbols of the most archaic sort, directly appealing to the latent primitive in each of us, it offers a perpetual temptation to fall back into something below our best possible. The impulsive mind is inevitably conservative, always at the mercy of memorized images. Hence its delighted self-yielding to traditional symbols, its uncritical emotionalism, its easy slip back into traditional and even archaic and self-contradictory beliefs, the way in which it pops out and enjoys itself at a service of the hearty congregational sort, or may even lead its unresisting owner to the revivalist's penitent bench. But on the other hand, creative spirit is not merely conservative. The Lord and Giver of life presses forward and perpetually brings novelty to birth, and insofar as we are dedicated to Him, we must not make an unconditional surrender to psychic indolence or to the pull-back of the religious past. We may not, as Christians, accept easy emotions in the place of heroic and difficult actualizations, make external religion an excuse for dodging reality, immerse ourselves in an exquisite dream, or tolerate any real conflict between old cultists and actual living faith. A most delicate discrimination is therefore demanded from us. the striking of a balance between the rightful conservatism of the cultus and the rightful independence of the soul. Yet this is not to justify even in the most advanced a wholesale iconoclasm. Time after time experience has proved that the attempt to approach God without means, though it may seem to describe the rare and sacred moments of the personal life of the Spirit, is beyond the power of the mass of men, and even those who do achieve it are, as it were, most often supported from behind by religious history and the religious culture of their day. I do not think it can be doubted that the right use of cultus does increase religious sensitiveness. Therefore, here the difficult task of the future must be to preserve and carry forward its essential elements, all the symbolic significance, all the incorporated emotion, which make it one of man's greatest works of art, whilst eliminating those features which are, in the bad sense, conventional and no longer answer to experience or communicate life. Were we truly reasonable human beings, we should perhaps provide openly, and as a matter of course within the Christian frame, widely different types of ceremonial religion, suited to different levels of mind and different developments of the religious consciousness. To some extent this is already done. Traditionalism and liberalism, sacramentalism, revivalism, quietism, have each their existing cults. But these varying types of church now appear as competitors, too often hostile, not as the complementary and graded expressions of one life, each having truth in the relative, though none in the absolute sense. Did we more openly acknowledge the character of that life, the historic churches would no longer invite the sophisticated to play down to their own primitive fantasies, to sing meaningless hymns and recite vindictive psalms, or lull themselves by the recitation of litany or rosary, which, admirable as the instruments of suggestion, are inadequate expressions of the awakened spiritual life. On the one hand, they would not require the simple to express their corporate religious feeling in Elizabethan English or patristic Latin. On the other, expect the educated to accept at face value symbols of which the unreal character is patent to them. Nor would they represent these activities as possessing absolute value in themselves. To join in simplicity and without criticism in the common worship, humbly receiving its good influences, is one thing. This is like the drill of the loyal soldier, welding him to his neighbors, giving him the corporate spirit, and forming in him the habits he needs. But to stop short at that drill, and tell the individual that drill is the essence of his life and all his duty, is another thing altogether. It confuses means and end, destroys the balance between liberty and law. If the religious institution is to do its real work in furthering the life of the Spirit, it must introduce a more rich variety into its methods, and thus educate souls of every type, not only to be members of the group, but also to grow up to the full richness of the personal life. It must offer them, as indeed Catholicism does to some extent already, both easy emotion and difficult mystery, both dramatic ceremony and ceremonial silence. It must also give to them all its hoarded knowledge of the inner life of prayer and contemplation, of the remaking of the moral nature on supernatural levels, all the gold that there is in the deposit of faith. And it must not be afraid to impart that knowledge in modern terms which all can understand. All this it can and will do if its members sufficiently desire it, which means if those who care intensely for the life of the Spirit accept their corporate responsibilities. In the last resort, criticism of the Church, or of Christian institutionalism, is really criticism of ourselves. Were we more spiritually alive, our spiritual homes would be the real nesting places of new life. That which the Church is to us is the result of all that we bring to, and ask from, history, the impact of our present and its past. Footnotes 125. Baudouin, Suggestion and Autosuggestion. 126. Cf. R. Seaman, Dyneema. 127. Bertrand Russell, The Analysis of Mind, page 78. A quaint example of this occurred in a recent revival, where the exclamation, "We believe in the Word of God from cover to cover, Alleluia!" received the fervent reply, "And the covers too!" End of chapter 5, part B.